So as we saw with InDesign, working with color in Illustrator is pretty much the same. Things are sometimes located in different places in the interface, but for the most part, it's very similar. Now, when you're working with color in design, you want to, of course, keep in mind that color helps with unity. So in this, for example, if I was going to make this a sidebar, and sometimes when I do tutorials, I work and you can just watch and sometimes see what I'm doing to assemble something. I would say when you're designing this way, moving things around, playing around, see how different configurations work is a very helpful part of doing the design. Don't think that you have to be very formulaic. You really can play around. So you'll notice that sometimes as I'm doing tutorials, I'm actually seeing better layouts and I want to try it. So it becomes quite instinctive. So you may see that I'm just moving things around and doing different things, and that's something to pay attention to. The more you do this and the more you watch it, you start to get a little bit of a read for a design and a layout. You saw I had that bar along the bottom, but it just wasn't working. So I wanted to move it up here and see if that was a better proportion and so on. So now I'm just going to select the image, hold shift, and move that over. So I'm slowly seeing these aspects of the design that I can fix. And sometimes that requires adjustments later. So for example, I just moved the image over. So in Illustrator, we have artboards. I don't want this artboard or this content touching this artboard, because if I were to adjust this artboard, it would think it owns this content just because it's touching. So just like we saw in our document setup tutorial, I can use the artboard tool to move this over and kind of get it away from that. When I export the PDF, we don't have to worry about this excess. It's bleeding, so that's good. It's bleeding far too much, but that's okay. It'll get removed when we do the export, which will come in a later tutorial anyway. Okay, so little things like that you see when I'm doing tutorials. I'm still designing. I can't help but do design. So I hope that helps you when you're watching it. But getting back to color, I move this shape up as a sidebar. I'm going to select it. Now there's a few things that I can do, of course, to create unity in this layout. And again, one of them being color, and that's by sampling a color. Myself, I'm not very good at creating color palettes. I don't necessarily enjoy having to come up with colors. I like when a client, for example, may have a prescribed color palette that they work with, part of their style guide, or they've given me a palette. I can, of course, develop palettes if I have to. There's a lot of sites online. A great one is adobe.color.com, I believe it is, and it will prescribe certain color palettes for you. But what I like to do that I really find brings unity into an image or a layout is sample color. So I made this shape, and I can go to the eyedropper. So we saw a bit of this in InDesign, and the eyedropper, it will sample formatting of type, it will sample color, it will sample shape attributes, and so on. It's quite helpful. In this case, I'm just going to use it for color. And I want to unify this layout around my subject matter. So if this was something I was doing pertaining to the animal, to a dog, I'm going to try seeing if I can get some color that's going to highlight the dog. So I'm going to select the eyedropper, and I have the item that I want to apply that new color to selected. And then I'll go over to the dog and I'll just see what colors there are that I can use. And what this does is it draws the eye between the two components. I've sampled a color from the animal, so now it's kind of unifying everything. So that's a really great way to bring color into your layouts, especially when you don't have specific colors prescribed that you have to use. Okay, so that's the first one. Now, when you do that, I had this selected, and it's available to me now as a swatch. So if we have our swatches open, which typically when you're working in InDesign, you should have your color swatches open. So again, that's available in the window menu and swatches. Now, this may be a great color that I want to utilize both front and back and through various parts of my work on this project. If I'm doing a poster, if I'm doing digital assets, anything, this may be specifically a color I'm going to use throughout the project to maintain consistency and to maintain that overall unity between all the items. So in my swatches palette, with that object selected, it shows me the swatch here, and I can drag and drop that right into the palette and save it. I can even double click on it and give it a name. I could call it, main color or main campaign color, or you don't have to name it, but sometimes it helps. And I've saved that color. Now, if I want to go to another part of my layout, I have the color there and I don't have to try and sample the exact same color again. Okay, so sampling colors, saving them. Sometimes what I do when I work on a project, I'll actually go through and I'll sample several colors. So you can see I didn't apply that to any particular shape. I just sampled it using the eyedropper, but it came into my swatches. So I'll save it, and maybe I want to get one more color from that image. And what that does is it creates a color palette for me. One of the best ways to get a color palette is to look at nature. If you are really struggling for a color palette that may be cold or warm, downloading an image that is like that. So let's say I wanted cold colors. I would download an image of something wintry, or even like an Arctic landscape. And I can go through and I can collect, just with the eyedropper, I can collect several different colors from the same image that allow me to develop my own color palette based on that feel that I'm going for. So it's very useful. Now, the other way that we can get color, and that you've probably heard of, is through the Pantone color swatches. And the way you access those is by going to Window, and in Illustrator it's a little bit of a maze, so you'll want to follow along. So Window, and you go to Swatch Libraries, Color Books, and then Pantone Solid Coded. Now what Pantone is it's packaged colors, where we have colors in the swatches here that I've selected. That color has a code. It's got a specific code. Now, Pantone certainly can't package all possible colors. They're pretty much infinite according to our eyes, but they've packaged several hundred colors. And we can access those through the Pantone palette. So I'll click here, and that opens the Pantone colors. Now, depending on how yours open and how you want to view it, you can change the viewing options here. So I always view mine in small list view because I like to see the names and the swatches. And one of the honest reasons that I do that is because I like to sort of memorize the range, the number range. So when I'm working with these colors, I know that if I'm looking for an orange, a bright orange, I'm probably going to go into the 1500s and so on. So it's just part of the way I work because I work with a lot of specified colors. But you can look at these in any way you want. The point is, you're seeing all of Pantone's current offerings of packaged colors. Now, the idea behind Pantone colors is for consistency. If I'm working on a brand and they have prescribed Pantone 1655 to their brand assets, wherever I'm using that color, I have to make sure I'm using the Pantone color. And that allows for consistency, but it also allows for what's called additional color printing. So color printing happens in CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, black. Those are the basic spectrum colors that any print color is developed from. What the Pantones are is a packaged version of a mix of CMYK. When you print CMYK, you're printing in 4-color process. When you have a Pantone color, you're adding a 5th color. Sometimes you're adding a 6th color. So you might do a CMYK print that has, this is a CMYK image because it's a mix of all different colors. And then if this were a Pantone color, that would be a 5th color on that. It's already sounding too complicated. The point is that Pantone colors are packaged colors. Brands typically prescribe a Pantone color to their brand, and several brands, of course, have several Pantones. Tellus has 2 or 3, for example, and then you would use those accordingly. But we can use Pantones either way, because when we write our PDFs, we're converting to CMYK. If you are doing Pantone work specifically, you'll know when you get to that point what to do. You'll be in a spot with working with design where you'll know how to work with Pantones. At the same time, if you ever get to the point where you have to use a brand's Pantone colors and do a 5-color print job and you're not sure, you know how to reach me. It's really not too difficult to set up your production files correctly for Pantone color printing when they're using the packaged color. What we'd be doing here, if I colored this with a Pantone color, what I'm doing is using a Pantone color, but when I export the PDF, it just gets converted to CMYK. Okay, so the short story of that very long story is you have all these colors to choose from. You can go through the Pantones once you've opened it up, and you can choose them and you can use them. It's very helpful. So sampling color using Eyedropper, we can get colors. Going to our Pantones, we can get colors. And by the way, the reason we use Pantone Solid Coated, that's the go-to. I know in the Pantones, there's several. You saw that there were a lot to choose from. CMYKs, metallics, pastels, and so on. Solid Coated is the go-to because most paper stock is coated. If you were printing on an uncoated paper stock, you would choose uncoated. We default to solid coated because that's the default stock, paper stock, and paper finish, we'll say, that's used in printing. So again, if you know, or if you're having to use any of these others, you'll know why, and you'll have reached the point where you understand why you may have to use a solid uncoated. So always default to solid coated, but then know that these others exist for specific reasons. The main thing to remember with Pantones is that they are a packaged color. That's why, if you use a metallic, it's literally like a metallic ink that they would put on top of a regular print job. Now the final way to get color is to just make your own. Okay, so if I didn't know what I wanted to do with this and I just wanted to play around I would either go to my color swatch there, my color tool, which I can access through various points, either in my swatches or in the toolbar, or by going to my flyout menu, new swatch. There's so many ways to do one thing in this program, but I can go there and then I can slide this around and change the color. The thing is, when I change this, you'll see that it's going to change there, change there. It's not going to change the one in my swatches. I can drag that swatch, that new swatch in, if I've created a new color that I want. Now, changing the color of things, you can select it, but you need to know that you're working with the fill and the stroke. So this here, we have the fill, and you can see when I hover over it, it says fill. This is the stroke. Right now there's none. The stroke is the outline, and we saw that again in InDesign. Now if I wanted to apply a stroke or an outline to this, I would click on the stroke to activate it. I brought it in front, so there it's activated, and then whatever I choose, that applies the stroke. And I can change the width of that stroke with my stroke weight and so on. I advise against not using strokes. They just don't make for a very nice detail in our designs. It's much cleaner without. But they're there for a reason, because in Illustrator and in specifically more artistic uses of it, we do apply strokes to a lot of items. Especially when we're working with logos, we'll use a stroke and then we'll turn it into a shape later and so on. That's a little more advanced than we're at right now, but keeping things free of strokes is important. When you're new to this and you just want a nice clean layout. The other way to change the colors is up here in your object bar. So here we have the fill, and it gives us access to our swatches, and we have the stroke that also gives us access to our swatches. And if you want no fill or no stroke, you're always going to the none swatch. So I don't want any stroke, so it's set to none. If I wanted no fill, I would go to the none. Okay, so color, I think the best way to approach it, especially when you're working on a layout, that you want to have that cohesion, that unity, is to really play around with sampling colors with the eyedropper. And the other thing is, remember, if you're working on something that has brand colors, you may be limited to what you can do. We saw that with Bell. Bell has their Pantone 301, I think it is. That is the Bell blue that they use. That's a Pantone color. So wherever I'm applying color on Bell stuff, I'm pretty much limited to that blue. So sometimes the brand that you're working on limits your color flexibility. Either way, there's a lot of ways to bring in color to your layouts.